From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
In his distinguished career, Harry Jaffa has taught at such institutions as the University of Chicago, Ohio State, and Claremont McKenna College and Claremont Graduate School, where he has spent, I suppose, the bulk of his teaching career. He has also published, either as the sole author, a principal author, or as an editor, some dozen books, most of them about topics American, some about the American founding itself and James Madison in particular, though perhaps his two most well-known books concern Abraham Lincoln, which has been the subject of his life work, carried on intermittently but with great intensity. The first of these two books was the classic Crisis of the House Divided, an interpretation of the issues in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And the second was a sequel volume published just last year entitled A New Birth of Freedom, Abraham Lincoln and the Coming of the Civil War. I think the reviews that the latter book has received could only be described really as glowing, and certainly together the two books comprise an absolutely priceless interpretation and testimony to the greatness of Abraham Lincoln. Unlike many of his colleagues, Harry Jaffa came to the study of the American founding in medias res. He moved from Lincoln back to the study of the founding and of James Madison proper, rather than beginning at the founding and working forward. That always makes what he has to say about James Madison and others interesting and piquant. Of course, it is also the case that Mr. Jaffa is himself interesting and piquant. He is a notorious controversialist, and he deserves his notoriety. About him, William F. Buckley, Jr. memorably said, "If you think it's hard to argue with Harry Jaffa, try agreeing with him." Among his more controversial assertions by proxy was the famous line from Barry Goldwater's 1964 acceptance speech, which we all remember, namely, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. This wonderful sentence did not win for Barry Goldwater the election of 1964. Indeed, it may have cost him the election of 1964, or at least it was a contributing factor to whatever the ultimate outcome of that campaign is, and in a way we still don't know what the ultimate outcome is, because the influence of Goldwater on American politics and of course on the conservative movement lingers even today. But this is the kind of sentence that Professor Jaffa would and indeed did give a marvelous 10,000-word or so Socratic defense to in those days. It's the kind of sentence that I'm sure he would argue James Madison himself could have written in its Socratic clarity. Of course, James Madison did not write that sentence, and I'm sure Harry Jaffa will explain why in his remarks. I give you Professor Harry Jaffa.
Thank you, Charles. Just by way of extenuation, let me say that the decision to use that sentence, which was not written originally for any speech at all, it was written in a memorandum designed to ridicule the obsession of the Rockefeller people with the subject of extremism. And somehow or other that memorandum got into the hands of Barry Goldwater, and he said he wanted a speech written around that memorandum. So I did. I wrote the whole speech, and not just those lines in it. And I think that, looking back on it, I think that in a way it had a kind of agenda for the whole Reagan campaign. And I thought that at the time, I thought that we had no chance of winning the election. The circumstances were such: Kennedy's recent assassination, the first Southerner in the White House since the Civil War, and the fact that the country was prospering with the Kennedy tax cuts. So, but I thought it was our duty to run such a campaign as would lay the foundation for future victories. And as a matter of fact, that happened. Unfortunately, the future victories were also followed by future defeats. But I think maybe we have recovered our balance now, I hope. In any case, certainly the country is balanced. Well, let me say that what I have to say here, the title of my paper is Calhoun versus Madison, and I have rather more to say about Calhoun than about Madison. But the reason for the collocation of those two names, well, there's a double perspective. One is simply that Madison, I believe, was the most resolute and determined opponent of Calhoun in the nullification crisis. Although it was not widely known, I think he was very active behind the scenes. He only published one document during that period, and that was an article in the North American Review in October 1830, in which he vigorously denied the authority claimed by South Carolina upon the basis of the Virginia resolutions. After Hayne gave his speech in opposition to Webster, defending states' rights and doing it on the basis of both the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, Hayne sent a copy of his speech to Madison, expecting to receive his approval. Instead, he got a slashing reply, denying completely any authority for the South Carolina position on the basis of the Virginia resolutions. And he even defended Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions. As far as the Kentucky resolutions were concerned, he made the point, which is right on the surface of it, that the radical measures which Jefferson threatened, including driving these states into blood and revolution as a result of the Alien and Sedition Acts, this was an appeal to the right of revolution. It was not a constitutional appeal at all, and did not lay any foundation for a constitutional process, which South Carolina claimed that nullification would be. But Madison devoted really most of his last years to fighting against the South Carolina doctrines. And in his Advice to My Country, which he wrote just before he died, and which he withheld until after his death, he left this warning. He said, which may be considered, his warning, may be considered as issuing from the tomb, where truth alone can be respected, and the happiness of man alone consulted. The advice nearest my heart and deepest in my convictions is that the union of the states be cherished and perpetuated. Let the open enemy to it be regarded as a Pandora with her box opened, and the disguised one as the serpent creeping with his deadly wiles into paradise. No one familiar with the writings of Madison's last years can doubt that the deadly wiles of the serpent creeping into paradise were comprised in the South Carolina doctrine of state rights, with its corollaries, the right of nullification and the right of secession. This is not less the case, indeed it is rather more so, because South Carolina claimed, wrongly but with some plausibility, the patronage of Madison's own Virginia resolutions of 1798. Against the allegation of this patronage, Madison protested as vehemently as any pope, bishop, or church father had ever protested against an imputation of heresy. Nor can there be much doubt that the serpent himself was John C. Calhoun. Certainly, the formulation of the Carolina doctrine, Calhoun had a number of co-workers. But the final perfection of that doctrine is to be found, above all, in Calhoun's Disquisition on Government and Discourse on the Constitution and Government of the United States, published in 1851 after Calhoun's death. But they fortified the conviction of the leaders of the Southern cause for the struggle to come in the last decade before the Civil War. They have remained the principal source of intellectual justification as well as emotional conviction for those who have remained faithful to that cause in all the time since Appomattox. During the Civil War, they convinced so notable a liberal, or supposed liberal, as Lord Acton, that the cause of the Confederacy was the cause of the defense of minority rights against the tyranny of the majority. Even today, there are many who believe that Calhoun's is the classic formulation of the problem of minority rights in a constitutional republic or democracy, and that his solution to this problem, as he himself, that is to say Calhoun, believed, represents progress beyond that of the Federalist Papers. Calhoun, in general, thought that his political science and the Disquisition on Government is a statement of the principles of political science as Calhoun understood them, which he thought to be a radically novel doctrine because based upon the latest developments in modern science. One of the other focal points, you might say, of this paper is that the status of Calhoun in present-day conservative thought. Calhoun is regarded as a hero was by Russell Kirk and by many people who belong to his paleo-conservative persuasion. In 1987, the Center for Judicial Studies, a conservative think tank in the precincts of the nation's capital, a think tank which at the time, I think it's now defunct, was referred to as by appointment to the Justice Department of Attorney General Edward Meese. They offered for sale at $150 each busts of 6 men. This is in the year of the bicentennial of the Constitution. 6 men that they called defenders of the Constitution. This 6 were James Madison, John Marshall, Joseph Story, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, and Edmund Burke. You will notice, of course, that Abraham Lincoln is conspicuously absent. And both Calhoun and Burke were great favorites, as you might know, of Russell Kirk. And one of the interesting features is that Calhoun and Burke, I think properly considered, represent almost exactly opposing points of view. Here's what, I can find it. Oh, here. This is how Leo Strauss regarded Burke. Burke sided with Cicero and Suarez against Hobbes and against Rousseau. Burke's political activity was indeed guided by devotion to the British Constitution, but he conceived of the British Constitution in a spirit akin to that in which Cicero had conceived of the Roman polity. That is to say, that's an end of quotation from Natural Right and History. This is to say that as Cicero had seen the excellences of the Roman Constitution in the light of the classical natural right teaching, so had Burke seen the excellences of the British Constitution in the same light. Of course, the two constitutions were very different, but each saw the respective excellences of his own regime in the light not of natural right simply, but of natural right guided by the light of prudence. That is to say, of natural right seen in relationship to the great difference in circumstance, the great difference in the time and place in which the regimes of the Roman Republic and of the British constitutional monarchy were formed. So, according to Strauss, Burke looked to interpret the British Constitution in the same way that Cicero had interpreted the Roman Constitution, which was in the light of classical natural right teaching. Calhoun, on the other hand, rejected all earlier political science. And here, if I can. Said Calhoun did not, like Burke, look back towards Cicero and classical political philosophy. The disquisition on government is in no sense founded upon, quote, the funded wisdom of the ages, which is the way Burke looked on the British Constitution. On the contrary, it represents the exact opposite. Tradition, whether as prescription, as classical natural right, or as Christian natural law, had no standing with Calhoun. His doctrine represents the claims of modern science. It assumes the superiority of the present to the past in every fundamental respect. Astronomy, this is according to Calhoun now, astronomy rests upon a knowledge of the constitutional law of the material world, according to which the several bodies composing the solar system mutually act on each other, and by which they are kept in their respective places. That's physics and astronomy. For this precise perspective of astronomy, Calhoun asks, what is the constitution or law of our nature without which government would not exist and with which its existence is necessary? In order to proceed with this question, Calhoun lays it down as an axiom that man is so constituted as to be a social being. His inclinations and wants, physical and moral, irresistibly impel him to associate with his kind. So man is, that sounds a little bit like Aristotle because he sees man only as existing within the framework of what he calls society. So society, because of the immutable law, psychological law which governs human action, drives men into conflict with each other. This sounds a little bit like Hobbes and the state of nature. Society really becomes a state of nature in which life would be nasty, brutish, and short, except that, according to Calhoun's account, society never exists without government, which restrains these antisocial impulses, you see. But government, according to Calhoun, is being governed by the same psychological laws as individuals are, becomes tyrannical, see. So the only solution to the human political problem is with something that he calls constitution. And constitution, the thing that transforms government from being necessarily tyrannical and despotic into something benign, is something that he calls the concurrent veto. See, you will see in all of this that Calhoun is devising a system which will replace the system that Madison, which you heard described very well and often this morning. And this is what he says about society and government. Although society and government are thus intimately connected with and dependent on each other, of the two, society is the greater. It is the first in the order of things and in the dignity of its object, that of society being primary to preserve and protect and perfect our race, and that of government secondary and subordinate to preserve and perfect society. The institution of Constitution bears the same relationship to government that government does to society, with this difference that Constitution has, by giving each interest in society a veto upon every other one, requires that these different interests coincide in their decision that the action of the government depends upon the concurrence of their will. The veto they have is called the concurrent veto. And when you think about it, you can see that the idea of concurrence as the basis of legitimacy and good government bears a striking resemblance, I think, to Rousseau's general will, from which I believe Calhoun's scheme is eventually derived. It comes to Calhoun, I think, through a succession of sources, but I think that probably the most immediate source is well, it's partly Kantian, but also partly Hegelian. What is a constitution? It is a government so formed as, quote, to resist by its own interior structure the tendency to abuse of power. That by itself sounds very much like Madison. Such a government Calhoun calls an organism. The first principle of organism in a popular or elective government is found in the control over the elected representatives of those who elect them. But this only means that the government of these representatives will not oppress those to whom they are responsible. The bellum omnia contra omnes, the war of all against all, continues, however, in the struggle between majorities and minorities. At this point, Calhoun has an advantage in his argument with Madison that is undeniable. That one advantage is that the government, when it's formed, constitutes an interest which is not in society before the government is formed. The Madisonian argument conceives of these neutralized majorities neutralized by the diversity of the factions which comprise the majority. But Calhoun says, and the experience of Jacksonian democracy to some extent bears him out, that once a government is elected, the people who participate in the government now have an interest different from the one that they brought to the government. They have an interest in oppressing those who are outside the government. See, one can see a lot of contemporary political experience, namely, big government grows by what it feeds on, and the more it grows, the more it feeds, and the more dangerous it becomes to the liberties of those outside the government. I must say, however, that Calhoun's own experience did not bear out his thesis, because the Jackson's administration was immediately split into factions, and there was one set of allies on the bank question, and another set of, and many of the people who supported Jackson on the bank were against him when it came to the nullification question. So Jackson's majority did not bear out that experience. Nevertheless, it's important, I think, to see that Calhoun did have an analysis of the defects of elected governments, even in the system devised by James Madison, because the Federalists, notwithstanding its many virtues, did not contemplate the operation of the party system on the majorities that are formed, so that a president who may have an institutional interest in protecting the presidency from the aggressions of the legislature or even from the aggressions of the court, may have a different interest as head of the party, in which he can exercise party discipline on people who might be from a different branch of government, but have more to be gained by cooperating with the president in exploiting minorities, you see. So now, this is what Calhoun thinks that the great protection against the tyranny of the majority is by the adoption of some restriction or limitation which shall so effectually prevent any one interest or combination of interests from obtaining the exclusive control of the government, as to render hopeless all attempts directed to that end. This is what the constitution, which means a system in which there is a concurrent veto of each interest to protect itself against the action of the government, so that the government cannot take action against that interest. And Calhoun says, this may be effected by taking the sense of each interest or portion of the community which may be unequally and injuriously affected by the action of the government, separately, taking the sense of each interest separately, and to require the consent of each interest either to put or to keep the government in action. This is the famous veto which by its presence transforms the government into one of a concurrent as distinct from merely numerical majority. The government of the concurrent majority, says Calhoun, tends to unite the most opposite and conflicting interests and to blend the whole into one common attachment to country. The same cause which makes it the interest of each portion to conciliate and promote the interest of the others would exert a powerful influence towards purifying and elevating the character of the government and the people morally as well as politically. I said, no knight singing the praises of his mistress, not Don Quixote celebrating the mystical virtues of Dulcinea del Toboso, ever waxed more rhapsodic than Calhoun on the excellences of the organism and of the concurrent majority. His assumption throughout, however, is that if the self-regarding passions are prevented from governing human action by the power of the veto, then the social and other regarding passions will have full sway. But what ground is there for this assumption? Why will the action of the government not take the form of collective selfishness or aggression? More important still is the question, why will any passions, even if other regarding, elevate the character of a government and a people? Calhoun's scientific conception of the soul is one of the passions alone. Reason doesn't play any role, except the reason of Calhoun looking down and seeing that this universal selfishness of the human soul prevents people from ever thinking unselfishly. They can think unselfishly only when they are prevented from acting unselfishly by circumstances which they don't intend and do not wish for, but which compel them to do something they don't want to do, which in turn turns out to be for the common good. But the common good has no rational foundation. It's simply the concurrence of wills which have no intelligent apprehension of the common good. Now, James Madison, remember, devised a scheme which has a certain resemblance to Calhoun's in that through checks and balances and through making the duties of the interest of the man in the duties of the place, trying to make selfishness work in favor of constitutional government. But Madison speaks repeatedly of the rights of the minor party and about the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party. Madison's idea of what constitute these rights and these rules is a matter of noetic, of intellectual perception, which he wants his system to come to resemble. Calhoun has no idea of the common good other than that it is common because there's nothing against any interest which can prevail. Now, you can also ask the question, where does Calhoun find the interests which are to exercise this veto? He never says anywhere in the disquisition how to identify the interests which are to be protected. Here we have to raise the question, for example, of slavery. Where were the interests of the slaves? They did not count. Why did they not count? Because history had not made them powerful enough to make their presence felt in a way which would entitle them to a veto. The tacit assumption underlying Calhoun's, you might say, Rousseauan general will is fundamentally Hegel's conception, or a conception of history, which was popular then and certainly is to be traced to Hegel. Throughout my new book, I have a kind of running commentary on Calhoun and Madison. And in it, I pointed out repeatedly the resemblances between Calhoun's thought and that of his contemporary Karl Marx. The idea of state rights in Calhoun is the idea of the collective rights of a formed political community, just as in Marx it is the collective right of the proletariat. The proletariat do not have any rights as individuals, they only have rights as they participate in a collective corporate whole. Richard Hofstadter, in his book on the American political tradition, a book which I think has filled the American people with more erroneous opinions about the American political tradition, but which nonetheless, since Hofstadter was a good phrasemaker, he called Calhoun the Marx of the master class. And basically, I think Calhoun is as much a right-wing Hegelian as Marx is a left-wing Hegelian. But Calhoun also identifies the two greatest constitutions in history before the American Constitution as the Roman Constitution and the British Constitution. And the Roman Constitution became an organism through the institution of the tribunes, an event made familiar to many of us, if not all of us, through Shakespeare's Coriolanus, you see. And the British Constitution had its similar impulse towards organism in Runnymede in 1215 with when the barons forced the Magna Carta on King John. Calhoun makes it clear, however, like a good Hegelian or maybe even like a good Darwinist, that in neither of these cases did any of the agents involved have any intention of accomplishing what they did. This was, you might say, the cunning of history operating through the passions of men. And this is an example of how passions rule, and only passions can rule. Calhoun, however, in common with other 19th century thinkers like Marx or Freud, ascribed a degree of rationality to himself as scientist, which he denied to the humanity whose laws of behavior he was elucidating for the benefit of his fellow men. But what I would like to emphasize here is that Calhoun's thought, which is generally regarded, particularly in the political science profession, which was to a large extent founded on part on doctrines inherited from Calhoun, it represents a decline on the level of thought represented by Madison and the founders in general. It is the exemption of the scientist from the universe of science is absolutely arbitrary. And you can ask, well, how is it that Freud, who says that all mental phenomena are determined, there's no freedom, and that's how the analyst can, examining the evidence from the psychoanalytic conversation, can then piece together the things that makes the person what he is. But then Freud thinks that in showing him what it is that made him what he is, he can stop being that, you see. But the question is, if that freedom exists now, why didn't it exist before? See? And it's Freud's insistence that, that there was no freedom before that enables him to say there is freedom now. That same exemption of the scientist from the universe that he describes with his science runs through many 19th century thinkers, but it represents, it's an absolutely arbitrary assumption which cannot be defended by reason. And of course, Calhoun thought that that he had given a perfect formula for dealing with the slavery question, because he wanted to empower the states who were committed to slavery with the ability to make any kind of veto on the action of the rest of the government, see. The slaves didn't count because history had not brought them. If the slaves deserved to be free, they would be free, which is a kind of tautology, but that was the kind of thought which has governed the states' rights school ever since. I should mention, however, that in most discussions of states' rights, even in most academic discussions today, when people discuss, do the states have these rights or that rights, there was no idea of states' rights for Madison or for any of the founding fathers which were not derived from natural rights. One of the phrases that Madison uses repeatedly, and I've made repeated use of it in my new book, repeated almost as a kind of a mantra, is that compact is the basis and essence of all free government. What he meant by compact is exactly what Lincoln meant by dedication to the proposition that all men are created equal. Madison did not put it in, but Madison did write an essay on sovereignty, which was part of the writings by which he was attacking the doctrine of nullification, in which he explains in detail what is meant by the word compact. What it means is that if we go back to the original principle of free government, it results from an agreement by people who are not part of any government. In other words, all men are created equal refers to the state of nature, in which no man has more authority over another than the other has over him. It is the voluntary agreement of these people to form a civil society, which is the original contract, the contract out of which majority rule, not minority rights, but majority rule emerges, you see. And Madison says that this agreement, which depends upon the mutual recognition, you see, of each person, of every other person, as having equal rights to have his life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, respected, and the object of government is the equal protection of the rights of those who contract to form the government. And out of this comes, as Madison says, what the lex majoris partis, namely the right of the majority. But the right of the majority is a right only to do those things which are in the interest of everyone. So the equal protection of the law means that the action of the government is never less that of, say, the minority than the majority. The limitations on the purpose of government and the limitations upon political authority arise from that original contract. And he mentions specifically that the rights of conscience are always exempt from any action of government. On this, he and Jefferson, and I think eventually all his fellow countrymen, agreed. But of course, the limitation of government from any interference with the rights of conscience lays the foundation for a whole series of other rights. But just pausing there, majority rule is possible only upon the social contract which makes the rights of individuals the object of the protection of the government. And so the majority has no unlimited right to do anything that the majority may think is wise. So the whole theoretical basis for the limitation of government is laid in the idea of this universal, this unanimous consent, because society arises from unanimous consent. And by the way, this means that civil society is a voluntary association. Calhoun, by the way, denies that civil society is a voluntary association. He says that membership in society and government is as involuntary as breathing. So you can see how you get the power of government having no regard for individual rights, because all individual rights are seen by Madison as being generated by the contract which brings men out of the state of nature and into civil society. But Madison adds to this unanimous consent as the underlying basis for the action of the majority, that the majority may not do anything that could not be done by unanimous consent. That is to say, that does not reflect the unanimous consent underlying majority rule. But he adds to unanimity as a sufficient basis for legitimacy, rightfulness. And the words rightfulness are italicized in the text. Unanimity and rightfulness. So Madison assumes a moral order which is implicit in that unanimous consent, so that, say, what the Jonestown people did by consenting unanimously to commit suicide, which is an example of how unanimous consent and majority rule can still go wrong. But of course, it would mean to wage unjust war or to enslave other people who are free in the interest of the majority. These things are assumed to be illegitimate. The legitimacy of majority rule rests on both unanimity and upon the limitations provided by the idea of rightfulness. Today, of course, people ridicule the idea that anybody knows what is right or wrong, that it's not just a value judgment, but this certainly was not the horizon of James Madison. Thomas Jefferson, in the Summary View of the Rights of British America, in addressing the King, this is in 1774, says the great principles of right and wrong are legitimate to every reader. The whole art of government consists in the art of being honest. That sounds strange today, doesn't it? but they believed that, and Madison certainly believed it as well. Well, I wanted to point out that, first of all, that the favoritism that Calhoun has found in the conservative movement is based upon an irrationality as profound as Calhoun's own. And the idea that Edmund Burke is a friend of people who are devoted to Calhoun doubles that absurdity, see. And with that thought, I will leave you now. So.
We have time for a few questions.
And going to the most extreme degrees in saying what should be done in order to defend that institution.
It was, I didn't hear a question. What you said elicits my enthusiastic support.
No, I didn't really mean it as a question.
Thank you for endorsing my views.
As a confirmation of, no matter how rational he may have been when he wrote in the 1830s, by 1848, he was as passionate as he could possibly have been.
Well, Calhoun, to give him credit, he was a marvelous writer, and however obscure in fact his propositions were, they had an appearance of lucidity, and he proceeded in a kind of mathematical way to deduce his conclusions from his premises. And people who got fascinated by his deductive method forgot about the premises and accepted the conclusions, you see. But in one of his remarks about when he laid down his Galilean or Newtonian axioms about the role of selfishness, which was for him a kind of gravitational, it was the corollary in human psychology of gravitation in the field of physical bodies. And he said that he went out of his way not to call this selfishness, because that was a moral judgment. This was just a fact, you see. And his remark about that is remarkably similar to a famous passage in Spinoza's Ethics, where Spinoza says that that one shouldn't call envy, anger, hatred, love. One shouldn't give these tabs of approval or disapproval, because they are as inevitable in the psychological sphere as storms and good, nice weather. We can't say that nature is being mean when a storm rages and nice when the sun shines, because these things are in obedience to impersonal laws, and that's the way. So Calhoun was certainly in that respect a successor to both Hobbes and Spinoza.
Professor Jaffa, I'm shocked to hear you describe or quote Leo Strauss on Edmund Burke approvingly on natural right, because Burke several times in the Reflections and Letters on a Regicide Peace and in his correspondence denounced John Locke's natural rights argument. In fact, he would have condemned both you and Leo Strauss for being far too abstract in your argumentation, because he held abstractions in contempt. When he defended chivalry, he wasn't just weeping for Marie Antoinette. What he was really defending was the chivalry created by medieval Catholicism in society. And he had nothing but contempt for dissenters like Spinoza and Dr. Richard Price. He did use natural law arguments, but he was very much a modern man using David Hume, Adam Smith, the latest scholarship of his time, but not at the control of his passions like Calhoun. And I don't see how you can quote Leo Strauss on Burke. I mean, nobody who does intellectual work on Burke takes Leo Strauss seriously on that particular subject.
Well, I do. and I would say that I can, the only short reply I can give to you is to quote Winston Churchill's essay on consistency in politics, in which he says that the wise statesman, keeping in harmony with the current of events, seeing him as a kind of navigator, he shifts his weight first to one side and then to the other side. The arguments he may use on one case may be directly contradictory to the ones he uses on another occasion. And I think this is true of Burke, and he particularly had Burke in mind. He said, we cannot call this inconsistency. The only way a man can be consistent amid changing circumstances is to change with them while preserving the same dominating purpose. And according to Churchill, Burke always had the dominating purpose of preventing tyranny. And the arguments that he used against the tyranny that he saw emerging in the French Revolution were not the arguments that he used when opposing as he thought, the tyranny of a corrupt court in Britain. I think that at the bottom of his soul, Burke was a quintessential Whig in British constitutional terms, you see.
The Whig liked Catholicism. The problem wasn't ever Catholic.
What's that?
The Whigs were anti-Catholics. They hated the papacy.
Yes, well, Burke certainly.
I mean, there's no way you can argue that away, or Leo Strauss could. It's a historical fact or circumstance. They hated Catholicism, and that's where Burke was separate from most of the English Whigs.
Well, by the time of the French Revolution, Burke attempted to be a defender of Christianity against the atheism of the Jacobins. In doing so, he abstracted from the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, which a generation earlier he would not have done. I'm sure that if he lived at the time of Milton, he might have said with Milton that I mean not tolerated popery, or even at the time of the Toleration Act, which exempted most of or perhaps all of the Protestant churches from the disabilities of citizenship, but did not exempt Jews or Catholics. Yet the forces set in motion in the Glorious Revolution culminated in civil rights for Jews and Catholics. And certainly, I mean, Burke, who was half Irish and half Anglican and half Protestant and half Catholic. His mother, I believe, was Catholic.
His wife, too. And Connor Cruz O'Brien's unearthed a lot of evidence indicating that Burke himself was a covert Catholic.
Well,
Burke himself was a covert Catholic. I'll just finish there.
I'm afraid our time has expired.
Well,
Thank you, Professor Jaffa. We'll have a...
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.